this this fiat currency system has made our society more centralized under the control of one government. And these governments have become more rigid and less competent because 200 years back, governments were run by people who were selected from the society because of their competencies. Today, we have bureaucrats and politicians who are professional bureaucrats and politicians, which means that they have zero real life experience.
Welcome to Rethinking the Dollar. Today I'm excited to have my guest, Mr. Jayant Bhandari, an investment strategist in the natural resource sector. Mr. Bhandari writes on political, economic, and cultural issues from several publications worldwide. Jayant also runs a yearly seminar in Vancouver titled Capitalism and Morality. So, Jayant Bhandari, thank you for joining me here on Rethinking the Dollar.
Mike, thanks very much for having me here.
Well, I actually went on YouTube and I saw one of your videos in regards to how Indians love gold, and you gave a nice presentation on how and why the cultural aspect of gold in India goes hand in hand. So I'm looking forward to getting your take on that, as well as the current situation with the rupee and things like that, and how that might kind of be interconnected with what's happening here globally as far as a push to remove cash. So looking forward to getting your thoughts on that. But before we get into that, I typically start off with some Rethinking the Dollar questions. And the first question is, what comes to mind when Jayant Bhandari hears the words Rethinking the Dollar?
Well, Mike, dollar is one of the most respected currencies in the world. The fact, however, remains that this is still a fiat currency. It is based on paper. The only value that underpins the dollar is that of regulatory edict. If ever that regulatory edict changes, the value of dollar is that of the paper that it is printed on, which is zero. However, given the fact that America even today continues to be one of those societies that respects private property, there is an enormous amount of respect that dollar gets around the world. And that is why dollar is still used as the preferred currency internationally.
Right. Good explanation there. Now, next question is, there's a big push to remove or to begin rethinking the dollar by a lot of leading nations around the planet. And so, in your opinion, is this an important matter? And if it is, how important is it at this particular point in time in history to begin really taking interest in what I like to call monetary awareness and monetary literacy?
Well, I mean, America gets a free ride on the fact that so many people around the world want to keep American dollars with them. Most countries around the world have their foreign reserves in US dollar. And the fact remains that, as I said earlier, America is one of the rare countries in the world that actually respects private property. It not only respects private property, it respects the individual a lot more than most of the other countries in the world do. And it is for this reason that most people associate a permanent value to the US dollar. And that is why they like to keep US dollar. Now, many people want to get rid of the US dollar from their countries. For example, Russia and Iran might want to do that. But the reality is that, do they do it because it makes financial and monetary sense, or do they want to do it because they dislike the US? And you have to, if it's because they dislike the US, they are taking a wrong position. If they want to give up on dollar and accept something else because they think dollar is a fiat currency, I completely agree with them. But most people aren't thinking that way, though.
Right. Good point there. Now, last question before we actually get into some of the heart and meat of the interview. If you were given a chance to be in front of the globe, this is a hypothetical question, but something that's quite entertaining. How would Jayant Bhandari describe what I like to consider the global state of the economy? If you were asked to give a complete summary of what's happening on this planet in regards to our economy, our monetary system, what would you tell the audience?
In my view, Mike, I think the world has started to stagnate. The Western countries have been stagnating for the last 1 decade. and there is no economic progress in the foreseeable future in the Western countries today. The emerging markets, those countries that are outside the Western world, are not only stagnating, they might actually be regressing towards their backward past. And in my view, a lot of those countries are ready to implode. We are in a moment of crisis for a lot of countries, and probably all the countries in South America, Central America, Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. The only exception I make is East Asia, which is China, Korea, and Japan, countries that I like. I, of course, like Hong Kong and Singapore as well. But most of these emerging markets are at a stage of a crisis, economically and socially, in my view.
Right. Good explanation there. We're in a moment of crisis. And so let's talk a little bit about, okay, so you're an international guy. You do a lot of traveling, in your industry to inform investors and whatnot on what's good and what's not. And so what are some things that are of concern to you? What are some things that may frighten you perhaps, or some things that may have you excited for 2017, given all the things that we're going to cover and things you've already mentioned?
So, Mike, people should try to understand the societies in Africa, Middle East, and South Asia. These countries would mostly be living in medieval kind of economies today had they not got the free gift of technology from the West. Now, in the last 100 or 200 years, they have interacted with countries in the Western societies, mostly Europe, and they have imported Western technology in their countries, which has meant that these countries in Africa and South Asia, the Middle East, have economically developed. They have adopted Western music, they have adopted Western ways of dressing, Western movies, but there's one thing they completely forgot to import from the West.
What's that?
And that is the concept of reason. These people in Africa, this is anyone who has been to these countries understands this thing, that critical thinking, argumentation, discussion, these concepts do not exist outside the Western world. Now, the problem is that this has created a major crisis for these societies because they have become economically very rich, but culturally, in terms of civilization, in terms of how they think, they still exist in medieval times. And that, in my view, has brought these countries into a very bad crisis situation. Their food habits have gone horrible. Their lifestyles are not very good. Health problems are increasing exponentially in all these countries. Right. So this is what, in my view, is the problem of the emerging market.
Right. Now you mentioned you're painting a very detailed picture as to why things are not good, and especially underdeveloped nations. And so, briefly, what could be some possible solutions for these countries? I mean, given the fact that they lack the technology, and you say reason, what would be some things that they can begin doing or transition into in the days ahead to really make a change?
So this is very common among people from the Western societies, or even for human being. We like to think that we can bring a change in lives of other people or in lives of other societies. The reality is, Mike, that if you see a problem with one of your best friends, it's almost impossible to change your friend.
All right.
You can't change other people's way of thinking. Similarly, you can see problems in other societies, but it's almost impossible to change it. Over the last 200 or 300 years, Christian missionaries have been trying to infuse the concept of reason in Africa and South Asia and South America. And they have got some success, but an extremely limited amount of success. Bringing a cultural change is a millennia-long process, and we have to accept it. This will take centuries, if not millennia, to change these societies.
Right. Fair enough there. So let's touch a little bit on your native land, India. And so over the last couple of months now, there's been a lot of bad news for the most part in regards to their currency and way of life there, and the cash currency crunch, all those details there. Give us a paint a picture for us to those in the Western world who may not even know or realize the threat against cash, and how India is kind of considered the test run that some people believe. So give us a little insight into what's happening in India with the cash situation.
Okay, so India cannot be the test run. This will be an utter failure. Indian Prime Minister Mike on the 8th of November decided that he wanted to pull out all currency bills with face value of 500 and 1,000 rupee on it, which comprised of 86% of the monetary value of currency bills in circulation. Now, India is a country in which 95% of consumer transactions are cash-based transactions. It's a country where 50% of people don't have toilets. It's a country where 1 billion people, about 60 to 70% of people, have zero access to internet. It's a country where half the country has no electricity connection. Can you imagine, Mike, how stupid must a decision would be in which the Prime Minister wanted to make this country a digital country in terms of currency? This is not going to work. This will be an utter failure, but it will bring a lot of pain for Indians in the transitionary period.
Right.
I have spent a lot of time in India since this announcement, and I have traveled significantly within the country to understand what the situation was. I have written series of articles on this subject. And the reality is that it's a country where vast majority of people earn $1 or $2 a day. They live in what you would call slum areas. About 80% of people in that country do not have proper houses. They don't have productivity, and all you're trying to do is to control their transactions. This is not going to work. This will cause an enormous amount of pain to these wretched, poor, and diseased people.
Right. And so the last I heard was that the cash was the 500, 1,000 was removed, but they implemented the $2,000, 2,000 rupee note. And so I guess there's not enough change now to really, if someone uses it, it's not enough change in circulation other than having to use a lot smaller denominations, which is causing a problem. So there's a shortage on bills over there. So, when you were there, paint a picture of what it's like to try to do, actual transactions where, there's not enough, paper to go around.
Well, you basically imagine, Mike, that I removed 88% of the blood from your body.
Whoa. And
even if I infuse the blood back into your body after a few hours, your organs will have started to fail by then. And that's what has happened in the country. They removed cash from the country, which meant that poor people could not buy food. Farmers could not sell food. Small businesses could not sell anything because people wanted to preserve whatever small cash they had for food purposes, which meant that small businesses started to fail. When small businesses started to fail, poor people started to lose their jobs. Now, the poor people could not buy food in the first place. Now, they actually could not even earn money to buy food. People were spending days and days lining up outside banks to convert whatever they had. The result was that the whole economy came to a stall. About 150 people died lining up outside the banks. 150 people died lining up outside the banks.
Wow.
Hundreds of other people killed themselves because of financial problems it created. Food prices crashed in the country. Now, can you imagine, Mike, why food prices would crash? This was not because there was an excess supply of food. This happened because poor people could no longer buy food. So hundreds of millions of poor people were going hungry now. Now, this means that farmers could not sell their food. They were dumping their food on the roads, which means that farmers are now going to go bankrupt. They will not be planting seeds for the next crop, which means that food will be in shortage in the next cycle and food prices will skyrocket. Mike, I can't even explain what this all means, if at all I understand what this all means, but everything is negative. This
Right.
is a disaster for the country.
Right. Now, I want to touch on one little issue there, how the government, of course, tries to, spin it in a good way of saying, we're trying to control the black market. We want to remove all of the illegal money that supports terrorism, drug. I mean, all the things they name. How, in your estimation, is there more to the story than just the idea of removing from the black market, or is this something greater than?
Okay, so Mike, corruption has skyrocketed in the country because tax authorities and police is now asking for twice as much bribe as they used to ask earlier. And every single politician and bureaucrat in that country asks for a bribe. So corruption has skyrocketed. Now, as far as terrorism is concerned, you have to sort out the underlying problems of Kashmir and northeastern provinces. Indian Army continues to be extremely heavy-handed when it operates in those places. Terrorism and problems in those areas have actually increased in the last 3 or 4 months. India hasn't been this close to a war with Pakistan as it has been in the last 3 or 4 months. So none of those things have improved. Now let's talk finally about counterfeiting. This has actually increased very significantly after the new bills came into existence. Remember, it costs you the same to print a 2,000 rupee note as it did to print 500 rupee note, and 2,000 is twice as much as the highest denomination bill that circulated earlier. So they have actually made it easier for people to print counterfeit bills now. And because this was suddenly implemented, people don't really understand what these bills look like, which means that even photocopies of these bills are being circulated as legitimate money. And police is catching people all over the country and at the border, bringing in counterfeit money. So counterfeit problem has actually, again, skyrocketed. Everything Modi said he wanted to control has become much, much worse today. Plus, it has destroyed the Indian economy. Now, let me tell you, Mike, why he did that.
Please.
Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, is a sociopath. He is a dictator. He wants to put in place a police state in the country. He wants Indians to suffer and dance around him in his glory. He wanted to create anxiety and fear among people so that people would start doing what he wanted them to do. He is proving out, in my opinion, to be the most dangerous politician Indian society has ever created. This is the same person who was alleged to be behind killing of about 2,000 Muslims in the state of Gujarat about 15 years back. The reason why the US and England had a ban on him entering America and the United Kingdom until he was elected the Prime Minister of India.
Whew, that's definitely a different story than what the mainstream media tells us, as well as you had a chance to watch my prior interview, episode 54 with a gentleman who's currently in India. You said I was kind of painful to watch, so you're definitely painting it more down to earth, in the street feeling of how bad it really is there. Now let's turn this over a little bit to the global aspect. And so just India is one crisis is underway. Then we have Venezuela. There's a currency crisis there. And there's mention of removing high denomination notes floating around in various other countries. So let's touch a little of those other countries and kind of give me an idea what your thoughts is with that and how will they succeed?
So Mike, in my view, any attempt to go cashless in these backward societies will not work. They are just not structured to go cashless. An attempt to go cashless in the Western society can and will work because people in these countries are law-abiding, and most of the institutions and the electricity and internet, etc., work in these countries. it's extremely harmful for Western society to go cashless. And the reason, Mike, is that in the last 200 years, 300 years, our economies have moved from being primarily agricultural economies to extremely complex economies, where we have hundreds of things that we do, hundreds of things we trade in and manufacture. Also, people are extremely mobile. The result is that while things should be more centralized today than they were 200 years back, this fiat currency system has made our society more centralized under the control of one government. And these governments have become more rigid and less competent because 200 years back, governments were run by people who were selected from the society because of their competencies. Today, we have bureaucrats and politicians who are professional bureaucrats and politicians, which means that they have zero real life experience. They go to the government right after their Ivy League colleges, and they have zero experience of what the normal guy's life is like.
All right. Now, you hinted at the idea of fiat currencies are, centralized and pretty much for control. Now, in your YouTube video, you mentioned about gold and how it's just it's a everyday thing in India. Now, share with me your thoughts on the precious metals as a form of as a hedge, as some people consider it, and how important it is, in your native land of India, and how that should apply to everyone outside, pretty much globally.
Well, I think it applies a lot more to countries like India than it applies to countries outside India. Let me tell you why Indians buy so much gold. Not only Indians, but also all the way up to Turkey, the Middle East, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and the Middle East. These people buy a lot of gold. And the reason, Mike, is very simple. This is not because these people are experts in monetary economics. The reason they buy so much gold is because investing in these countries does not make any sense. These countries are negative yielding economies. So when I invest in the stock market or property in India, I typically get a negative rate of return. If I get a negative rate of return, bank interest is negative real interest in India, has historically been negative interest rate, which means that I am much better off investing in gold because at least my yield is zero. It is for this reason, Mike, that these people have historically invested in gold. And because what Modi is doing is actually destroying the economy, people will have an inclination to invest even more in gold than they did in the past. And the same is happening in the Middle East. Now, coming to the Western societies historically have grown very rapidly. In the last century, except for the last 3 decades, Western societies grew at a much faster rate than any of the non-Western societies. Now, this is the problem with the Western societies. Western societies, probably for the first time in 300 years, are starting to stagnate. Their growth rates have fallen to 0.5% or 1% or 0%, and sometimes negative. Which means that if Western countries continue to repress their economies through regulations or through controlling the lives of individuals, economic growth will stagnate in the West, and that is when people will start paying more and more attention to passive instruments like gold, because they will have been left with no other choice but to secure whatever surplus they have.
All right. Now let's move a little bit to the United States and what's happening here. We're 2 months into a new year, a new presidency, and there's a lot of things, a lot of division, from everybody in the country over, he's not my president, but he's the president. I mean, just so much stuff, especially in the African American community, in regards to just borderline. It's kind of like it's more borderline hate than anything else. But Share with me your thoughts on how Trump will do when it regards to the economy. He has $1 trillion infrastructure plan he wants to roll out, and we're almost at $20 trillion worth of national debt, and he's a gold bug somewhat. So share with me your thoughts on Trump and his presidency going forward.
Okay, so I don't believe in the concept of government, Mike. I am a sovereign individual, and I don't like being told how to live and what to do. However, given the fact that we do have governments, and even if I don't vote, I can decide on who is doing a good job. And in my view, for the first time in the history of modern politics, that I have come across someone who is doing what he promised he would do. And this is what Trump is doing. So again, government takes collective decisions. No one will agree with all the policies, and there will be collateral damage. And that is why government is an unnatural entity. However, given that, the fact is that Trump is doing what he promised to do, and a lot of what he's doing is something that I agree with. So I see in the last 10 or 15 years, for the first time, I'm optimistic about the US. He might be able to turn things for the US in the short term. In the medium and long term, US and the West does not have a very good future. But in the short term, I'm very optimistic about Trump and what he's doing.
All right, you said that the West, long term doesn't have a very good future. Why is that? And kind of give me some ideas around that concept.
So, Mike, we started our conversation about distinguishing people of the Western society and people from outside the Western societies. People from outside the Western societies are ingrained in the culture of beliefs and faith and mysticism and the lack of reason. They are superstitious, irrational people. And this culture does not change for centuries, if at all it ever changes. The reality is, Mike, that migration of people from outside the Western society hasn't really done a lot of good to the Western society's culture.
Right.
And I completely agree with Trump on that. I might not agree with some of the policies he is taking on that, but at least he is courageous enough to accept that there is a problem with migration, there's a problem with minorities, and he needs to deal with that problem.
Good point. A good point there. Now let's talk a little bit about the idea that the dollar's strong apparently, and so there's been a lot of he's pretty much the first president, according to mainstream stories, that to mention or hint at the word dollar itself, to have it come out of his mouth. Nevertheless, and so he's mentioned about it being too strong. And so, weakening the dollar, what does that look like, and how will a weaker dollar impact those living in the U.S., and what would it do to our partners that are around the world that are holding our dollars?
Well, why should you want to weaken the dollar? The more expensive the dollar is, the better it is for Americans. You get to buy cheapest stuff from outside the U.S. Mm-hmm. Again, as I said, I don't have to agree with everything Trump is doing. The fact remains that dollar will be in demand going forward, or at least in the short and medium term, because everything else outside the Western world, outside the US, is so much worse. Look at what's happening to euro. Euro is collapsing. It's going to probably not even exist in 2 or 3 years' time. Currencies in Africa are worse than toilet paper. Currencies in South Asia is worse than toilet paper. The same in South America. And you were talking about Venezuela earlier. We know about Argentina. Now, yes, US dollar is still a paper-based currency, but it is so much better than what else these people have access to.
All right, good point there. Now, let's talk a little bit about the idea of rethinking the dollar. And so the whole idea of rethinking the dollar kind of came about from the idea that China, Russia, the BRIC nations and all the organizations that's forming outside of our country, I guess, in a way of counteracting the collapse of the dollar or whatever might, monetary collapse or whatever, some people like to say. So explain to me a little bit, if the dollar is going to be used for a while. So I take it that it's going to be still the reserve currency up until some point. And then when that point is reached, because there, I guess history says 40 or so years, there's a new currency, and the dollar's been around for, 100 years now, pretty strong. And so how will China and Russia and their massive accumulation of gold, what will that play in the days ahead?
The situation is with China is that I think China is the future of humanity. There is real progress happening in China. I would not be surprised if within the next few decades, Chinese currency becomes the reserve currency internationally. And I can understand that given the fact that Chinese yuan is probably a better currency already, Chinese government wants to dump the American dollar. And that's a very legitimate thing to do. I would actually keep my own money, instead of keeping it in American dollars, I prefer to keep it in renminbi and in Hong Kong dollars. They are not only provide me a better interest rate and a hedge and a kind of parity with American dollar, I also get better interest rate. So I'm much better off owning those currencies than I am owning the US dollar.
Right. Now, some people would say, if all fiat currencies ultimately return to their intrinsic value of zero, or, they return to nothing, just paper, and the ink is probably worth more than the paper itself sometimes. Some people might question that. Why would he still keep his money in the yuan or the Hong Kong, or why would he even keep it, period, if it's going to return to zero possibly? Or, just a little devil's advocate there. Share with me your thoughts.
Oh, of course, Mike, I keep 2 or 3 months of my expenses in cash. I keep everything else of my surplus and wealth in something else. You should buy stocks, you should buy gold, you should buy properties, you should invest your money. There is no reason to own paper cash, which has zero inherent value. And eventually, Mike, this system will crash. The reality is that, as I said, in the last 300 years, everything about human beings have improved. We have become economically and extremely complex societies, but what has become both is a concept of money. We had a concept of money 300 years back when what we exchanged had either inherent value or was backed by something real. Today, we don't have anything which has any inherent value, and it is not backed by anything. The government promises to give me a photocopy of exactly the same paper. So this system has inherent flaws. It's a hilarious system, actually. It should never have come to exist, but because we have grown around that system, we think this is the way the system works. But we have no proper monetary system, and this system will crash. And you should position yourself for this system to crash, and that includes crash of American dollar and Chinese renminbi eventually.
All right, that is a great explanation there. So as we draw to the end, you kind of, hinted at my last question, but I want to just, narrow in a little bit more. And so, rethinking the dollar, I would like to, get your thought on the Federal Reserve note 2, 5, or 10 years from now. Will it be used domestically, and will it still be something that's want to be held, internationally 2, 5, 10 years from now?
2, 5, 10 years is short-term period, Mike, and I think I'm increasingly optimistic about the US for now. Euro will crash in the meantime, and a lot of these emerging markets will face enormous amount of problems. And I'm excluding, of course, East Asia, which means that American dollar will be in demand, American properties will be in demand, Chinese and Indians will continue to buy properties in the US and in Canada and in Australia and in New Zealand. So in the medium and short term, I would be optimistic about the US dollar. But listen, something that has eventual value of zero, why should you own too much of it in the first place, Mike? Why take the risk of owning something when you should actually be investing that money or buying something hard, something of real value with that cash?
All right, Jayant Bhandari, thank you for taking time to sit down with us and share your thoughts on the situation in India as well as your thoughts here on the global economy. Can you give the listeners who may not be familiar with you and your work where they can find you at and how they can stay in tune with what you have going on?
Well, thanks very much for the opportunity, Mike. Anyone who wants to look at my work, everything is on my website, which is jayantbhandari.com.
Sounds good. Well, Jayant Bhandari, thank you for taking time to sit down with us. Look forward to continue to follow your work and to stay in touch. And hopefully, everything does pan out, in a positive manner in the days ahead here in the U.S. as well as the situation in India. So thanks for your time and look forward to, staying in touch with you.
Thank you very much, Mike.
My pleasure.